Well, hi, this is Robert, and welcome to today's show. Well, I'm going to take a look at a couple of incredibly important historical documents for the United States, the Constitution of the United States and the Declaration of Independence. Why should we read it? How should we read it? A little bit of history. We're going to touch on quite a few things today. And my guest today is the author of this book, How to Read the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence. Please welcome to the show, Paul Skousen. Paul Skousen, welcome to the show, sir.
Thank you very much. My pleasure to join you.
Okay. Well, let's go ahead and start out with a little bit about you. Can you give an introduction to the viewers? Who is Paul Skousen?
Right. Yeah, I'm a journalist by training and communicator by trade. And I went to journalism school and ended up going back to Washington, D.C. to get a master's degree at Georgetown in, this is a great title, National Security Studies. Now, why would a journalist go do that? Well, it was my ticket into the CIA. So I went and worked there and then spent a couple of years at the Reagan White House in the Situation Room as an intelligence officer. And the Iran-Contra affair, some of us remember what that is.
Sure, well, I'm old enough.
That cost me my job. Oh. So I went back to CIA and stayed another year, then came back here to my home state of Utah. And in the meantime, I was in corporate communications with various companies. And then now I teach communications and journalism at a local university and a local college. And in the meantime, I enjoy writing, so I put together some messages. My father was a prolific writer and defender of the Constitution and liberty and freedom, and he passed away in 2006, and I've been trying to help him finish up those works he left us. So that's what my labors there have been, and I just need to say this part. Kathy and I have 10 children. Wow. And 38 grandchildren, but what makes that exciting is that we heard number 39 is on the way.
Excellent. Congratulations.
So, thank you. So family is everything.
Right. And speaking of family, your last name is Skousen. I'm sure some watchers will recognize that name. Can you talk about some of the famous people in your family other than yourself?
Oh, there's famous and then there's infamous. Right?
Okay.
Well, my father is quite prominently known. He wrote a book called The Naked Communist, and that became a bestseller, sold over 1 million copies back in the early 1960s. It became the Bible for understanding the crooked philosophy of Marxism and communism and how it worked. When I was at CIA, it was a thrill to me to go into our historical intelligence collections in the library there at headquarters. And there's 3 copies of The Naked Communist, 2 in English, 1 in Spanish. So when Dad came to Washington, I took him for lunch to CIA, and he went into that little office and autographed the copies. And like you, the librarian said, "Oh yeah, this was the only book we had." So it was really a helpful tool during that period of confusion. It exposed and showed us a lot of what's behind communism. But that was my father, and then he was in the FBI. He was an agent for a while. He served for J. Edgar Hoover in headquarters, FBI headquarters, as one of the communications directors. And he enjoyed that a lot, had a close relationship with Mr. Hoover, and an outstanding man whose name, reputation, and private life has been smeared and distorted and with lies. Just a good, patriotic American. Dad was able to teach down at Brigham Young University, and then he retired. He wrote more books. People might have heard of the 5,000-Year Leap. Let's see, another one, a companion book called The Making of America. And these books talk about basic principles of what is liberty when people ask that question. He describes that in those books. Mm-hmm. So that's my father. And this is actually his office we're in right now.
Oh, great.
He wrote a lot of those books.
Okay, well, let's go to your book real quick. Here it is right here. How to Read the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence. Paul, why did you write this book?
You know, I never expected to, but every semester I quiz my students just because they seem to become less and less informed with the passage of time, each new batch.
Yeah.
I always ask, who in here, by show of hands, has read the Old Testament, the New Testament, the Quran? We have a lot of Muslims that come into our classes. The Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. On all those questions, I only get 1 or 2 or 3 hands. When I get to the Constitution and Declaration, if it's more than that, it's usually, I ask them, well, when did you read it? They say, well, I was homeschooled. Once in a while, someone says in high school. And it bothers me that we're engaged in this great freedom, liberty process here in the United States, and people have no clue what the foundation of it. So I thought, well, you need to read my dad's books. And then one day it dawned on me, they can't. Those books are for people who already have a foundation in freedom and liberty.
Right.
They've not read the Constitution. So I said, you know what? We need a link from absolute newness to the United States and our system over to some of these great works. And that link, let's just read the document. That's all. Is it that complicated? No. So here, I'll hold your hand and we'll walk through it. That's why I wrote it.
Yeah, and you write in the book that that everybody should read it once or twice a year.
Yeah.
The two documents. How come?
Well, it's interesting. The more times you go through something, you start to pick up the nuances.
Yeah.
There's no wasted sentence in either of those documents. There's no transition thing there. Every word and statement was carefully chosen for the purpose of putting in writing what it is we're standing up for. That rule applies with anything. I use it with something my dad said. Read the Bible, read it once a year. If it takes a long time, about 6 months, 8 pages a day. But you'll notice every time you go through the Constitution, something stands out and you go, oh, I keep reading right past unalienable. I think I need to go find out what that means finally.
Yeah.
And that's what opened your mind.
Sure.
Yeah.
Great advice. Now, the Declaration and the Constitution are two distinct but related documents. Paul, can you give a short summary of the little bit of history? Don't go too far, and because that can last a long time.
Yes,
but the purpose and the function of each.
Right. Essentially, the Declaration was a formal indictment, a formal accusation against the King George III, and his ministers in Parliament. These are where our rights have been violated. We are subjects of the British monarchy here, the British system. Why are we being treated separately? So it was really an indictment against the king. These are all the violations, and we're not going to put up with them. And therefore, we hereby choose to separate ourselves. So what Thomas Jefferson did so beautifully is he took these eternal, timeless principles of human rights, and he lists those. This is what every human gets, whether it's written in law or not. These are natural born rights from nature or of nature's God, he said. And these are being violated. So that came about after about 12 or 13 years of continuous nonstop abuse of the colonists. The 7 Years' War had ended, and Britain was in debt, and they needed to pay it back. They're going to tax the colonists, and the colonists are saying, hey, you know what? We're going to move and build communities anywhere we want. You have no say. We're not going to pay this tax. It's unfair. And that started a big mess. And I believe today is not today the 244th year since that first skirmish in Concord and Lexington, the shot heard around the world. I think it's April 19th, 1775.
Excellent. And how about the purpose and the function of the Constitution? It's different.
Right. So now that we've established our rights, this is what we're going to be. We fight the war. Now we need a way to govern ourselves. They had actually two attempts. The first one, the Articles of Confederation, came up and said, all right, we're 13 separate states. We're going to work together, fight this war together, and we need to have some form of government whereby we do this. It was a miserable failure. It's amazing George Washington made it through the war with the Congress incapable of supporting him. So it was pretty obvious that was a failure. So towards after the war ended, delegates got together and said, our country is paralyzed. We need 100% on every single vote to get anything done, and that's not working. We can't tax each other because someone's going to object. How do we grow? So they sat down and invented something that had not been done before. And what's so beautiful and unique about our Constitution is that pretty much everything in it was already there somewhere in different forms, different philosophers, ancient and current day. But these great thinkers brought it all together to create a balance between human nature and political power. And that structure, that took them about 4 months, that structure formed into our United States Constitution. It's ingenious, it's elegant, it's beautiful, and it's really tough to say people can improve on it. It's only been improved upon 27 times, and 10 of those, well, several of those, half of the later amendments were bad for the Constitution, but best form of government that's yet been put in the earth.
Now, you mentioned King George III. For the viewers who may not be familiar, can you give a little bit about King George III?
Right. He's interesting person. He actually took the throne when he was just 22 years old. Britain was just coming out of its 7 Years' War, French-Indian War. He had to follow the advice of the ministers and whatnot. Just a young man at that time. And as he tried to rule over there in England and do what he hoped was goodness, the ministers and the parliament, they had other things in mind. And so they were the primary engine of pushing these coercive things on the colonists over in America. But he was a father. He had 15 children. So, yeah.
You try to catch up to him.
Tried to catch up. Yeah, he did a good job there. But he was interested in the sciences and nature, and he had a real inquisitive mind. He was more of a creative type, and his interests seemed to be elsewhere. As far as being a good monarch, he needed a lot of help from the others. He actually had a mental breakdown after the war for independence ended, and for a while there, they gave a name for what he might have had, but it might have been a genetic mental illness issue. But he died, about 20 years after this war. But seems to be not as deep thinking or as strategically thinking as his ministers were. So he put his full monarchy authority behind their decisions and choices. And they were not always that smart. What it ended up, they got the colonists to fight back. That's what.
So back then, would the founders have considered King George a tyrant at that time?
Yes, probably a tyrant, but I think they were more angry with his ministers. The Declaration of Independence it indicts King George III himself. But really, the oppressive ideas, the Stamp Act and the Sugar Act and the Townshend Acts and all those came out of his ministers in Parliament. So while they attacked him directly, it was really the whole government that was conspiring. Yeah.
In the book, you talk about something I haven't heard of before. It's called the 7 Pillars of Tyranny. Love to hear more about that.
Right. Yeah. It's interesting. I did another book called The Naked Socialist. That was one that my father didn't get to. He had planned on it. But if you go back and look through history, 6,000 years of human history, as far back as we can go, there are certain common elements present in every dictatorship or tyrannical government. 7 basics. And that's what those are that I list in the book there. And the first is an all-powerful ruler. That person can come in with a military, or like King George III, he can inherit it. And that need not be just one person. That ruler can be a group of people that are in charge. That's the first common element of tyranny, is that all-powerful. Yields to no law, doesn't need to listen to the people. And then a funny thing happens. Once that power exists at the top, society becomes divided into a caste system. So you have at the top the ruler, and then you have the ruler's supporters, and they get all the perks and the land grants and the tax breaks and everything, the ownership. And then come the enforcers. Those are the people that want to be in the king's favor, or the tyrants. And then the bottom is you and me, the workers. Yeah. We do the labor. Okay, that's the second pillar. Now, to keep the people from rising up and rebelling, he makes a promise. And the promise is, hey, we're going to make it fair. We're going to take from these greedy, evil, rich people, and we're going to give it to you. So they talk about leveling. That's what the founding fathers called it, these ideas of leveling that never work. Yet that's what socialists do. In today's environment here in the United States, look at all the politicians, in particular the Democrats that are all announcing, they all have something they're going to give us, right? Yeah. And take it from somebody and give it to us. That's the same, that's the tyranny at work. Well, to be able to give like that, you need to then regulate the economy. And so that's the next one. Regulation, set the prices, control who can do what, put all kinds of constraints around an economy so you can fulfill your promise. And that always is suicidal to a nation's economy. So after we have regulations, they impose all this by force. That's another common element. The people have no say in it, and they impose that. And I just draw your watchers and listeners' attention to the fact that communism was, what are we up to, 160 million? The number varies, but 160 million dead to impose communism. How many people died to put our Constitution into, ratify it and make it law? 0. We didn't force that on anybody. That's what freedom and self-government is. So tyranny, that's another pillar, is force. And then the next one is the control of information. Here in the United States, the information is largely controlled by a corrupt media. We all know it. And that's present in, go back to ancient Rome, to the Spartans, go back to ancient Greece, go back to the medieval period. Control of information is critical for a tyrant to retain the control. And then the last one is, we have unalienable rights that we were born with. We don't need those written down, or we don't need some government to say you've got them. They were given to us by God, by the act of being born. And those rights are totally stomped on and abused and violated in this 7-pillared organization called tyranny, socialism, communism, any one of them.
Yeah, and we see these things even to this day. So it just shows us that we haven't learned our lesson over all these millennia, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
We're letting
okay. Let's go ahead and take a little look at the Constitution in a little more detail. Paul, how is it structured?
Right. It's built beautifully. It's built on an order of how you might land on a desert island and say, all right, how do we get organized here first? And so the general structure is, Article 1 is, how do we make the laws that we're all going to agree to abide by, so we don't kill each other in the process, so things are fair. So Article 1 talks about the 2 government bodies that handle that. Our legislature, that's the Senate and the House. They pass the laws. Now, Article 2, we need somebody to kind of be in charge of things, who can kind of direct the actions of our nation. That's the executive branch. So that would be the president, and his responsibilities to protect us, make sure our laws are carried forth, and if there's concerns he has, he can raise those with the legislator. That's Article 2. The third one is the judiciary, and that's the third branch of government. That branch is supposed to look at the disputes that might arise and deal with those as best they can based on the rules in the Constitution. So that's the first three that talk about the formation of our federal branch. And that, most people just kind of shrug their shoulders and say, cool, but that is actually the prime number one beautiful outcome, is to separate those powers. It's an ancient idea, but in all other countries, those three powers are usually held in one person, one body. So to keep them separate was a beautiful contribution. And then after that, we move into other parts of cooperating. The Article 4 talks about our states. What rights does a state have? That's described there. How do we get a new state? Can we divide a state? How do we do that? What's the process? That's in Article 4. Article 5, well, what if we want to change it? You know, how do we amend it? And Article 5 describes how to go through that process, the correct process. Today, the Supreme Court does it fairly frequently. It doesn't go through the process of amending. And that's why a lot of us are angry at the Supreme Court, because they make a declaration and it's unconstitutional. And we can talk about that. Now, Article 6 is kind of tidying up some things. When the war was fought, the nation incurred a lot of debt. And it says in Article 6, we're going to pay the war debts. So George Washington wanted to encourage all the citizens and say, hey, we're not going to leave you hanging. We're going to go ahead and pay you back for your sacrifices. We will do that. So that's in Article 6. Also, an oath of office. So they had a problem. The states had already established their own constitutions. Now we have a federal constitution. Where the two overlapped, the Constitution of the federal level had to be superior. So elected officers had to take an oath and swear to uphold that Constitution as superior to their states on those areas where they overlapped. So that was Article 6. And it has a couple more details in there to pay attention to. But Article 7, the last one, is the ratification. So that's how we make the Constitution the law of the land. And they learn their sad lesson from the Articles of Confederation, where they said it has to be 100%. Now they said it just has to be a majority, and they establish what that majority is in Article 7.
And basically after that is the Bill of Rights and the amendments.
Correct.
Yeah.
And then after that, there were some people that would not sign the Constitution because it did not have a Bill of Rights.
Right.
Yeah, and the argument was, hey, if you make a list, you're going to leave something off that list. That's dangerous. We just know that they're there. Don't try to list them. That's what the arguments were, and there's truth to that. But the majority said no. And so George Washington said, please just ratify it and then send in your amendments. So they sent in 189 suggested rights that should be mentioned specifically, and it was boiled down to 17 and then down to 12, and those 12 went out to the states and only 10 were ratified. That's the first 10 amendments.
Yeah, and you write something in the book that I think we all must remember, is that these rights are not something new. They're not created by the government. They've always existed, right? Can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, every human being has these unalienable rights, and we attribute those to God. Those of no faith, we attribute them to simply the fact of being a human. You have these rights of being your own person. You're not born here to be someone's slave. You're a sovereign entity, and you have the right to choose as you please. No one has the right to tell you no. unless you harm others, right? You can choose what you want to. You have the right to property, to acquire, develop, and dispose of it. You have the right to associate with people, to assemble, the right to be treated equal. These are all some of our unalienable rights: to defend yourself, to have compassion, to have a conscience, to religious beliefs. That has nothing to do with anyone else. That's yours, solely yours, so long as you do no harm to other people. And one of the greatest rights we have is the freedom to fail. You say, now, why is that a positive right? The freedom to fail means the freedom to innovate, and the freedom to experiment, and the freedom to discover, the freedom to try. And if government clamps down and controls your life, you can't do that. You can't fail. Then the growth process won't happen either. So those unalienable rights are ours, whether we have a constitution or not, whether we have a Bill of Rights or not, whether we live in America or some other place or not.
Yeah. And I don't believe the founders ever envisioned some big central all powerful government. And because here we had all these states, right? These separate entities. And the 9th and 10th Amendments are very important to understand. Remember, particularly at least in my lifetime, the real increases in federal power over the years. Agree or disagree?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
And one of the biggest mistakes was the 14th Amendment. That's what the Supreme Court uses to impose its will on you and me in areas that the federal government has no right to do. Now, the 14th Amendment, 13, 14, and 15, those were the repair amendments after the Civil War. So, yeah, the 13, 14, 15, it gets rid of slavery and it allows everyone to have a vote. But in the 14th Amendment is this little phrase. It says, no state may pass any law that inhibits or denies the privileges and rights and opportunities of others. And this is what they do. In my state, we don't like abortion. We voted against it. Well, that's our right. That's a state prerogative. But someone brings that to the Supreme Court and challenges what my state has chosen, and the Supreme Court does what the 14th Amendment requires: go through due process, try it in a court of law, and they do. And then they declare, sorry, you have to allow abortion in your state because we've passed a law that deprives people of their rights. Now, this is a little sleight of hand where the Supreme Court takes the issue of abortion, which is not discussed in the Constitution, as are a lot of these other controversial issues, and this is how they impose it as law. This is how they step outside of their boundaries by using the 14th Amendment. So you and I suffer because of that, and we need to change that one and repeal it, put everybody back where they belong in their federal branches.
Yeah, so that is really contrary to the 10th Amendment then.
Yeah, it's essentially repealed the 10th Amendment.
Yeah. Wow.
Yeah.
I never thought about it that way.
Yeah, it's tragic, and we need to stand up and have that put right again.
Yeah. Now, according to the Constitution, which I've read a number of times over the years, Article 2 shows that the president really doesn't have that many areas of responsibility, right? The commander-in-chief of the military, appointing judges, and a handful of other things. But things have really changed over the years. Do you agree with me or disagree?
Yeah, agree, absolutely.
Yeah.
The roots of that are back when there was some interstate trade problems going on, and we have shipping and railroads and the market. Well, that's a proper watch place for the federal government, but Congress decided they would give the president an agency that would oversee these problems and difficulties. And for example, you've got a 39-inch gauge on some railroad tracks and it hits the state line and it meets a 24-inch gauge. The trains stop, and what do you got to do? So yeah, make the rails the same, et cetera, et cetera. Well, those similar issues were handed to the president in the late 1800s, and they began to add more and more and more. And these are the regulatory agencies. And I've checked into it. No one knows the exact number. It's like 400 or more. We know the main ones like OSHA and the FCC and regulate,
EPA,
right, et cetera, et cetera. So we know those. But those have all been given the power to make law. Now you look in Article 1, and it says right there, Congress is the sole body responsible for making laws. Yet all these regulatory agencies do almost every day. And if you don't obey them, there's real punishment, fines, jail, taken. So all that has been dumped over in the executive branch. And the president can appoint the leadership of those, but there's this embedded bureaucracy that moves us towards this controlled, socialized form of government, which the founders never envisioned. And as you said, it's now expanded and grown to this monstrosity that's out of control. In answer to the question, what do we do about it? Well, it needs to go back to Congress. And everybody says, whoa, Congress can't handle all of that. Well, yeah, right. That's why the founding fathers said the federal government's job is limited, very limited. It's not supposed to be in these details. Those are supposed to be handled at the state level.
That's right.
And we're no idiots. If we have a comparable problem of a 39-inch gauge and a 24, we can solve it.
Well said. Now, I want to go ahead and get back to your book briefly before we close out the show. And in the book, you discussed a lot of different ways to memorize the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. Can you talk about some of these ways for the audience?
Sure. I'll give you two tricks. All right. One is the Declaration, the other the Constitution.
Okay.
For the Declaration of America, for independence, for America, take pride in America. That's what I want everybody to do. Take pride in our country. P-R-I-D-E. So this is a way to remember the 5 essential parts of the Declaration of Independence. So first, P for preamble, and that's the very, very first little paragraph. Preamble for P, and then part 2, that's where we talk about the rights. We hold these truths to be self-evident. So that would be the R for rights. That's how you remember that. And then after they discuss these rights, life, liberty, and happiness, and the importance of maintaining that, then we go into 27 charges against King George III. And these are indictments. So there we go, P-R-I, indictments. So that's what we say. You did these 27 things, you and your ministers, here they are. This justifies who and why we're going to declare our independence. D is the defense. After they list the charges, then Jefferson wrote, what have we done to defend our position? So there's 2 paragraphs where they defend themselves. And then the last part is the execution of that. They're not asking permission. They're not suggesting that they ought to part ways. They are executing their declaration in that last paragraph. We hereby declare ourselves free and sovereign, and from this point forward, we are a nation. They've executed their whole argument in that last paragraph. That is the Declaration of Independence in the last paragraph. P-R-I-D-E. So you can remember that one. In the Constitution, we have 7 articles, and we've all watched Star Wars, right, and Star Trek, and all these great names, and R2-D2, and C-3PO, and Luke Skywalker, and Princess Leia, and Q, and Savick, and Mr. Spock. Have you ever heard of Ledge Sasser? Oh, maybe Jar Jar Binks, but not Ledge Sasser. So he's a made-up name, Ledge, L-E-J, Legislative, Executive, Judicial. Sasser, States, Amendments, Supremacy Clause, and Ratification. If you'll say Ledge Sasser twice a day, 3 times in a week, you'll remember it. And someone will say, oh man, where do we find what President Trump Can President Trump really do that? Where would I read about that? And you go, L-E-J, legislative executive. Oh, that's Article 2 gives the job description of the president. So there's your two ways, pride in America and ledge sasser.
Very clever, very clever. And for the audience, you can find that in the book, and I will link to the book when I publish this show. Paul Skousen, any final thoughts on the documents we talked about, your book, or any other related topic?
Well, it falls to you and me to perpetuate this freedom formula. We did not inherit it. We stepped into it. It was a gift handed to us. The leaders that we elect into office, it is their responsibility. They are the lifeblood of our Constitution. We as a nation tend to follow our leadership. It's so critical that those who go in understand the limitations that we placed upon them. So you and I would benefit future generations by taking the first step. Just read it and read it again and then again and start to understand. And that introduction will connect us to the great books that elaborate on it and show why political power must be held restrained or we will lose our liberty. And people say we're immune to it. We are not. The rising generation has no idea how much we've already lost, and we will continue unless people will take responsibility. And that's what you're doing with your program. I'm grateful for what you're doing. Through the small and simple efforts we can each make, great things can be brought to pass. Let's not be asleep at that switch.
Well said, well said. Well, I want to thank you, Paul Skousen, for joining me today and to talk about this really, really important topic. Thank you, sir.
Okay, thank you. I so appreciate it.